No. They take it off and put it somewhere else. I get it. Didn't sound like it. Now it's working. Okay, so it has to be.
Nice. Hold on, let me turn this off. All right.
Over the. Testing, testing. That's
I'm
good.
going to introduce Barbara.
Okay. You gonna get your pen out of here?
And which one is this advance?
Hold on. I'm gonna get the pen on. Up and down right here.
Up and down, okay.
Oh. I need my little spoon.
You really do not need to say much, you know? I mean, really, Rick, you know. But I keep that for things you know, I have to send it to and,
Okay. No, I don't have that much to say.
no, don't.
We have time. We don't want to start early.
You must feel sometimes as if you live here, don't you?
Yeah.
When I was on the board, that's how I felt.
Yeah, they're going to kick me off the curriculum committee chair. Actually, the whole curriculum committee in January.
Because you've done 6 years?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But I will still be organizing
Practice,
classes.
of course. Yeah, that's good. I did that too. 6 years was enough. Plenty. Good to see you. I'm sorry I didn't know about Ken until I read your. We'll talk. Can we talk afterward? Okay. Yeah. You doing okay? Oh,
So glad to be
yeah. I know.
beeping and dinging and
Oh,
lights flashing. Oh,
You should have called me. I'm an expert at that. Unfortunately.
just
That's good.
nice.
so tall.
Tell them the Muslim ones.
What would I do without my yellow? This is how I went through college. Yellow with black pen, and I can't give it up.
Yeah. There's not much of a choice.
But, you know, I should be doing it on the computer. It would be easy to read and everything, but
I
I,
was using for typewriter.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
Here we can start.
Good afternoon.
You good?
Good afternoon. I guess we'll get started. Zoomers, you're muted. Please stay muted. At the end, if you have questions for Barbara, you can put them in the chat and we'll monitor the chat. If you're in the room with a cell phone, if you could please silence it or turn it off would be greatly appreciated so it doesn't hopefully go off. And Rick Gold is going to introduce our speaker for today.
Thanks so much, Pam, and welcome to Summer Wonders 2. As the organizer for the curriculum committee, it's been a challenge at times to try to fit all of the courses and speakers that are interested in speaking to you. And so we came up with the idea of having a collection of presentations that really you don't have a theme in common. And this is the second one that we're doing in the summer, which kind of shows the popularity. So today I'm going to be introducing Barbara Oberlander, and she is a retired professor emerita of history at Santa Fe College. And she's given numerous presentations on historical figures throughout the community. She was Santa Fe College history professor for 30 years. She holds a BA in political science from Wellesley College, an MA in history from Case Western Reserve University, and a PhD in the history of American civilization from Brandeis University, my alma mater. Professor Oberlander will discuss the extraordinary life of Jane Addams, who was a peace activist and a leader of the settlement house movement in America. As one of the most distinguished of the first generation of college-educated women, she rejected marriage and motherhood in favor of a lifetime commitment to the poor and social reform. Inspired by English reformers who intentionally resided in lower-class slums, Addams, along with a college friend, Ellen Starr, moved in 1889 into an old mansion in the immigrant neighborhood of Chicago. Hull House remained Addams' home for the rest of her life and became the center of an experiment in philanthropy, political action, and social science research. Barbara?
Thank you. Thank you.
I took my pen away. How loud are you? Is this good?
Mm-hmm.
Too much? Okay.
This is going. Thank you.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. I've entitled this presentation, The Most Dangerous Woman in America, Jane Addams. You can see that that description of her is in quotes. It is a quote by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover in the 1920s, who called Jane Addams the most dangerous woman in America. And my question to you is this the same Jane Addams that was often called America's first saint? Is this the same Jane Addams that the New York Times in its obituary referred to as one of the best loved and known women in the world? Is this the same Jane Addams that won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931? Is this the same Jane Addams that the state of Illinois has declared a Memorial Day for? Is this the same Jane Addams for whom recently a statue was dedicated in the Peace Garden at Fresno State University in California, where she resides along with people like Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King? And the answer is yes, it is the same Jane Addams. And in a sense, I will say that J. Edgar Hoover was right. She was a dangerous woman because she dared to believe in peace at a time of war. She dared to believe in social equality at a time of tremendous poverty in this country. She dared to believe that people from different nationalities, backgrounds, and religions could all live together harmoniously. And she dared to believe that America could become a better place. This is a dangerous woman, for sure. Oops.
You got it.
Okay. Jane Addams was born in 1860 in Cedarville, Illinois. She came from fifth-generation Americans. Her father could trace ancestry to a grant from William Penn, a 500-acre grant to an English family. Her father, who you see on the left, owned a mill, a bank, land. He was very prominent in the financial, political life of the community. And in the 1850s, he was elected to the state Senate of Illinois. He ended up being one of the founders of the brand new Republican Party dedicated to opposing the expansion of slavery. And there is in the Addams collection several letters from Abraham Lincoln himself. And it begins with, "My dear Double D." And that's how Abraham Lincoln referred to her father. During the Civil War, John Adams financed a company of Union soldiers. Her mother died when she was just a baby, and that meant the increased influence of her father. Jane Addams would say later her affection for him was, quote, dog-like, unquote. She lived constantly in the shadow of his ideals and his achievements and his sense of moral responsibility. She referred to herself, quote, as an ugly, pigeon-toed little girl, unquote, whose crooked back meant that she held her head to one side. A childhood illness had caused this problem. But when she was a little girl, her father took her to visit his mills. And what struck her was the poor circumstances in which many of the mill workers lived. And she called them horrid little houses, unquote, and wondered why anybody had to live that way. She wanted, of course, to attend college. Rick told you that this is now with the first generation of college-educated women after the Civil War. Remember, a lot of colleges that had been closed to women opened their doors to women after the Civil War because there was a lack of male students. But Jane wanted to go to Smith College, which was one of the new, very special women's colleges in my home state of Massachusetts. However, her father wanted her to stay more close. And so she ended up going to Rockford Female Seminary, which was known as the Mount Holyoke of the West. There was a strong intellectual atmosphere, but it was also intensely religious, and she chafed under some of the restrictions. In fact, I was very amused to read that she and a friend had read a book about opium and decided to try it. And they actually became so high that they were discovered by one of the teachers, and everything was confiscated. But she wasn't always as straight-laced as people thought. She was very popular at college. She studied Latin, Greek, French, the natural sciences, ancient history. She graduated with the highest honors. Here she is as a student at Rockford. She looks very serious here. She was also editor of the school magazine, and you can see her name at the very top. She was the editor-in-chief. She loved being a college student. She said it gave her a sense of identity, a community, and she excelled in all the facets of college life. It gave her great self-confidence. She emerged as a very, very good speaker, and she began to show that amazing force of personality that we will see later. But she wanted to do something significant with her life. And in a college debate series, she talked specifically about how women's potent influence in society could make a difference. The post-Rockford years were very difficult. Her father died very suddenly in his 50s of a ruptured appendix, and she decided that she would have surgery for her back issues. She did, but it took her almost 2 years to recover, and that meant her plans to go to medical school had to be put on the back burner. And so when she writes about this, she says those years after Rockford, she was absolutely at sea for the next several years. She didn't know what to do, and marriage, as Rick pointed out, was not really an option for her. She doesn't appear to have even considered it, although we will see she had very close female companions. And she talked about the fact that there was a family claim on spinster aunts who were always popular for being taking care of people in the family, nephews and nieces. And she said she chose spinsterhood, but she rejected the family claim. Through the 80s, she had bouts of depression, and she felt, quote, "I am without purpose and ambition," unquote. But she took several trips to Europe. And when she went to Europe, in particular to London, here she is about this time as a young woman, she and her companions visited this place. It was called Toynbee Hall. It was in the East End in London, and it was a place where Oxford students lived and reached out to the poor neighborhoods surrounding. She was very taken with that idea and decided, with her close friend, Ellen Gates Starr, who was her companion on these trips to Europe, that maybe they could implement that idea in the United States. And so they chose Chicago. After all, she was from Illinois. And Chicago looked like this. Now, you have to understand that when Jane Addams was born in 1860, Chicago had 100,000 people. Okay, 100,000. By 1890, 30 years later, 1 million people lived in Chicago. And Chicago could not cope with the influx of people, many of whom were immigrants, and it became a terrible place with a vicious reputation. In fact, Lincoln Steffens, the famous muckraker, called Chicago, quote, first in violence, deepest in dirt, loud, lawless, ill-smelling, the teeming tough among all American cities. And you can see it, typical street conditions in Chicago. Yes, that is a dead horse on the street, and the children are playing around it. This is what a Chicago alley looked like, and there were many more. So Jane Addams and her friend decided that they would pluck themselves down in one of the worst parts of Chicago, which was the 19th Ward, and they would try and do what the students of Oxford had done in Toynbee House. Remember, this is the high point, the high tide of immigrants flooding into the United States through Ellis Island. I suspect many of us in this room can trace our ancestors to that incredible migration. The tenements in Chicago were overcrowded, and you had many people living in the same room, like this, family of 7 in 2-room tenement in Chicago. Jane Addams wrote about this. The streets are inexpressibly dirty, the number of schools inadequate, sanitary legislation, what there was, unenforced, street lighting bad, paving miserable, and altogether lacking in the alleys and smaller streets, and the stables of the horses, of course, foul beyond description. Now, this is a nationalities map of the area around Hull House in 1895. Of course, you can't read the key. It's color-coded to show different nationalities. We're talking Russian, Italian, Slavic, Polish, Irish, German. We're talking every religion you can think of. And they were all crowded in, 50,000 people crowded into this 19th Ward of Chicago. And this is where they started in 1889, Hull House. It had been a mansion built by a very wealthy Chicagoan, but by the time Jane Addams and Ellen Starr took it over, you had stockyards down the street, you had stables, you had saloons. It was a mess, to say the least about this. In the area that they moved into, you had 7 churches, 2 missions, and 250 saloons. That says it all. So the goal of Hull House, which, as I mentioned, opened in 1889, was to provide first an alternative place to the saloons, to provide a nursery for the children, baths, a gathering place, clubs, classes, social events, ethnic celebrations, to open the door for immigrants and expose them to all facets of American life, art, language, to teach American values, and to be an intermediary between the social classes. By 1905, they had 13 buildings. 9,000 people a week came through the doors. It was an astonishing success. You had 90 volunteers, a lot of them young women. Here's what the reception room at Hull House looked like. And by the way, Jane Addams used the money that she had inherited from her father to get it all going. And then, of course, once the money was spent, they had to raise funds. And Ellen Starr was very good at that because she had connections to many wealthy groups in Chicago. Here we've got bathing babies in the nursery in Hull House. Look at the tubs. Remember tubs like that? And here's a nursery and play area. Here's a photo of Jane Addams in 1896. If you're keeping track, she's now in her mid-30s. She turned out to be a very successful administrator. And Hull House became a model for many other settlement houses in other cities. And anything you can think of, Hull House offered. So here we've got a boys' gymnasium. And the question, of course, many people ask, was Hull House integrated? And the answer is, for the most part, no, because the 19th ward was predominantly white. It was European immigrants. Black residents of Chicago lived on the south side. They lived elsewhere. So they didn't have immediate access to Hull House. But by the 1920s, Hull House had established community clubs for African Americans, and this is one of them. They also hosted reception for the 4th annual meeting of the NAACP. If you look carefully, you can see Jane Addams in the first row. She's got one of those fabulous hats. She was important, by the way, in the establishment of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. But all of this was not enough because the 19th ward was controlled by this man, Chicago Alderman Johnny Powers, who could be bought for any sum you wanted to name. He was the boss of this 19th ward. He was a Democrat. He was head of the local Democratic group. And the immigrants in the 19th ward knew him as the man who showed up with a turkey for Thanksgiving, who got their son out of jail, who helped them when times were tough, who showed up to funerals and weddings and family ceremonies. They considered him a friend, but he was corrupt through and through. Now, I'm sure that many of you know that city politics in this country in the late 19th century was full of stories of corruption, of people who could be bought by contractors who wanted to run the city's trolleys or put up a building. And it's so interesting. I mean, if you look at the salary he had and where he lived and what he owned, as I said, no price was beyond him. Jane Addams was aware of this. She hadn't planned to go into politics, but how could you avoid it? The lighting was bad in the 19th ward. The garbage wasn't picked up. The streets in many places were not paved. The only person who could make a difference was the city government. And that meant that she had to get into politics. So the first thing she went after was garbage collection. And she had her carriage equipped at 5:30 in the morning, and she followed the city garbage collector in her carriage to point out that they weren't collecting the garbage in the 19th ward. And she got herself appointed, sorry, I'm gonna go back. She got herself appointed as garbage collector. And she made sure the garbage was collected. She organized community improvement associations, and they went after the city government and put pressure on them to pave the streets, to have better lighting, to establish a park. And she was good at that. She was good at applying political pressure. She became an activist. She was even elected to the Chicago Board of Education. And of course, Johnny Powers had to run for re-election, and she supported the reform candidate. There were 3 elections, 3 tries to get him out. It didn't happen. She received threatening letters. She persisted, but Johnny Powers was shaken by this woman at Hell House who was trying to get him unelected. And so he tried to make peace with her by giving her some of the demands that she wanted. So this started a trend. Over the years, politics became essential to Hull House activities. And it became famous partially because of some of the women who volunteered there. Julia Lathrop, her concern was children who were arrested and tried in an adult court. And she pushed and pushed and pushed, and she helped Chicago establish the country's first juvenile court. I can't tell you how important that was in terms of the immigrant families who lived in the 19th district. Florence Kelly fled an abusive husband with her 3 children to Hull House. And what she was concerned about was the long working hours for women in factories. And so she forced some of the city fathers to go on a tour with her of the factories. And as a result, there were changes. And the governor of Illinois appointed her the chief factory inspector of New York, of Illinois. And it was the first time that we had had that. So the people who volunteered at Hull House spilled over into the larger community and made a huge difference. Jane Addams was fascinated by what was happening in Russia. And she visited Leo Tolstoy in 1896. And she wrote about him. By the way, she was a prolific writer, many books and many articles. And this one appeared in McClure's magazine. It was about her visit to Tolstoy. She was impressed with some of the things that Tolstoy advocated for. And as I said, she became involved in politics, very much associated with what we call the progressive movement. which was a reform movement from about 1890 to 1930 in the United States. And the progressive movement crossed party lines. Essentially, they believed the government should be more responsive to the needs of the people, and they brought about various kinds of reforms, some of which we still have today, like the initiative and referendum for citizen participation. They brought about direct election of US senators instead of having them chosen by state legislatures. And in 1912, Teddy Roosevelt ran on a Progressive Party ticket, the Bull Moose ticket, and Jane Addams supported him. Here he is in 1912. He did not win in 1912, but she had supported him partially because he was a proponent of women's suffrage. And that became one of her main causes. It occurred to Jane Addams, as well as to many other people in the women's suffrage movement, that you couldn't really bring about all these reforms without women having the right to vote. And women who were engaged in housekeeping all the time understood the kinds of things that had to be done to make their housekeeping safer. So here she is demonstrating for suffrage with Republican convention delegates in Chicago in 1912. She's the one seated in the carriage closest to us. Another shot of her, here she's standing up. That's Carrie Chapman Catt in the background, who will be one of the people responsible for the winning strategy that brought about the 19th Amendment. And she wrote an article. Remember I said she was a prolific writer. She wrote an article, Why Women Should Vote. It appeared in the Ladies' Home Journal, which had a very wide circulation. And this is what she said. Women must extend their traditional domestic duties to the ballot box. Addams stressed that women's individual conscience and devotion are no longer effective to safeguard their families. Modern society had grown too big and complicated. Health and safety were now utterly dependent on the city administration to enact laws to protect the home from the dangers incident to modern life. She argued that voting for these regulations enabled women to continue to fulfill their traditional duties. I mean, think about it. You bought food, but how could you be sure the milk was safe? How could you be sure the food was safe? How could you protect your children if there wasn't adequate street lighting? How could you protect them if dead horses were left lying in the streets? I mean, these are powerful arguments, and they were used by many people, not just Jane Addams. She even testified before Congress, the House Committee on the Judiciary, and she talked about the fact that there were many women in the United States who already had the vote in individual states by 1912, but there were many women who were left out. And here's a poster for the National American Women's Suffrage meeting in 1912, and you can see who's presiding. This meeting was held in Philadelphia, and if you look at the campaign evening, you've got Jane Addams presiding. Here she is about this time, 1914, photographs. And she wasn't finished. Jane Addams was a peace activist. She absolutely rejected the idea that war could bring benefits or progress. She felt that war led to exactly the opposite, that it led to more problems than it solved. And from her experience in Chicago, she was convinced that people from widely different backgrounds could get together and live in harmony. So when World War I broke out in Europe in 1915, she and many other women went on a ship. It was called the Peace Ship, and they went off to Europe to try and get mediation and negotiation between the different nations at war. And they founded a women's peace party. Here they are on the ship. That's Jane Addams in the middle. Many prominent women from American society were part of this peace group. And this was the first International Congress of Women held in The Hague, Netherlands, 1915. That's Jane Addams in the first row, second from the left. The numbers are because this photograph tells you who everyone is. And this is the first International Congress of Women's for Peace. It'll be called the Women's International League for Peace. But although she was applauded for these efforts, and 2 years later, when the United States entered the war under President Woodrow Wilson, the entire mood of the country shifted. And suddenly, Jane Addams, who was still a peace activist, was being called a traitor. Even Teddy Roosevelt talked about these women as cowards. She held fast to her beliefs. She was a lifelong pacifist. She never gave up that belief. I can't imagine what she would say about the world situation today. But during World War I, she received threatening letters and she was reviled in the press because of her beliefs. After the war, she resumed her efforts. And here is the meeting of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. It was held in Zurich, Switzerland in 1919. And Jane Addams is there. She is third from the right. The Women's International League for Peace and Freedom was founded, and it is still going today. It has representatives from over 40 countries, and their goals remain the same, although they've expanded them to deal with issues of gender equality and environmental issues, but they still are very strong believers in world peace. Here is Jane Addams about 1926. Yes, she knew Eleanor Roosevelt, 1929. Here they are meeting in Westport, Connecticut. Jane Addams is on the far right. And during these years, she was a strong supporter of the League of Nations, hoping that it would prevent another war. And here she is at the time of the Nobel Peace Prize, 1931. Actually, Jane Addams was in the hospital at the time that she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. She had had a severe heart attack and she was recuperating. But here is the New York Times article. The first American woman to get the Nobel Peace Prize. A wonderful photo of her at her desk, writing letters to people about all kinds of issues, for sure. And one of the last photos of her at Hull House with her beloved children. Now, people often ask me about Jane Addams and whether she had any close companions. And the answer is yes. It is this woman, Mary Rosett Smith. They were together for about 30 years. Jane Addams referred to it, quote, as a marriage, unquote, but we really don't know what that means. They were together in the last years when they both coped with illnesses. They had a house together in Maine. And Mary Rosett Smith was on the board of Hull House, came from a very, very prominent family, and was very important in fundraising, which was a constant concern for Hull House. Jane Addams died in 1935, complications from cancer. Mary had died just the year before. Whoops. There's a photo of them when they were young women, one of the rare photos. And by the way, Jane Addams destroyed all their correspondence to the disappointment of historians, but she burned all the letters. After Mary had died, she burned the letters. And so people speculate about their relationship, but they can't really say anything definitively since we do not have the documents. The New York Times obituary of 1935 sang her praises, but added, quote, her views were sometimes considered dangerously radical. Socialists and other radicals met at Hull House, and her opponents sometimes forget that her liberal attitude in permitting such meetings did not include a membership in the groups she tolerated. That's very important. One biographer has said, you have to see Jane Addams' mind like an empty apartment. She was willing to have lots of furniture put in, and she let all these people come to Hull House and argue different viewpoints, and it could be radicals, it could be socialists, it could be labor people. That was fine. It didn't mean that she belonged to any of those groups. She just believed that people should be able to express their different viewpoints. A Jane Addams stamp was issued in April of 1940. This is a wonderful memorial to her that was done just the year after her death. It was part of the Federal Arts Project in Illinois, and there's Jane Addams in green, welcoming immigrants. You see a soldier breaking a sword, and it was a tribute to her. Illinois, as I said, several years ago, declared a special day in her honor. And of course, her wonderful quotes. The good we secure for ourselves is precarious and uncertain until it is secured for all of us and incorporated into our common life. Nothing can be worse than the fear that one had given up too soon and left one unexpended effort which might have saved the world. If the meanest man in the Republic is deprived of his rights, then every man in the Republic is deprived of his rights. What has maintained the human race despite all calamities is faith in new possibilities and the courage to advocate them. This is a memorial to Jane Addams, a very interesting one. I have not seen it. I'm hoping that perhaps some of you have. It's in the Chicago Women's Park and Gardens, and it was created in 1993 to commemorate her life and work. And it's one of the first monuments in Chicago to memorialize a woman. And what you have here are hands, intertwined hands, sculptures of hands on all those stone monuments that you saw, beautiful hands. And another one. And finally, this is the Peace statue at Fresno State University. They have a peace garden, and this statue was dedicated about 19 years ago. And there's Jane Addams holding up a little immigrant child with a globe of the world. It couldn't be a more fitting tribute to her. So, yes, J. Edgar Hoover was right. This was a dangerous woman, an activist who turned personal need into something extraordinary, essentially pioneering the whole field of settlement houses and social work. She had a lifelong commitment to improve the lives of poor, to help especially immigrants, to work for a better world. She was not afraid to take stands. She was a woman of courage, conviction, moral integrity, and yes, to J. Edgar Hoover, this was one darn dangerous person. Thank you for listening.
We're open for comments or questions, either from those online or those who are here at OCAMIC.
Thank you, Barbara. You always bring stories that just are so inspiring. It makes me feel like a slouch.
Me too. Me too.
Great comment. Other comments or questions?
Thank you, Barbara, again. Is Hull House still in existence?
No, the building was, the question is whether Hull House is still standing, and no. The building was taken down, but there is a Hull House museum. I think the original mansion is still there as a museum, but not the complex.
This was an excellent presentation. Thank you for coming and giving it to us. I was wondering what address of the Hull House.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
I know this keeps going out. Where in Chicago was the Hull House located? Down in the Loop or?
Halsted Street. It was on a Halsted Street.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Other comments or questions?
Any questions on that?
Go ahead, Phyllis. You can ask your question. Yeah. Unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Okay.
There we
Thank
are.
you so much, Barbara. Just another excellent talk. I had never heard of Jane Addams before, but she was such an important figure of her age. My goodness. It seems to me that there were a number of women at that time who were not married, who didn't have children, and who therefore had the energy and the time and the stature available to participate fully in the political process, in the social process. And I just wonder where, well, there still are many women now very much involved. And because of other factors and the fact that we have the vote, but it's just very so interesting to me. I know I'm being very bumbling here, that there were a series of women who were not, and I hesitate to say burdened, but burdened with answering the requirements of being a housekeeper and a mother. That's all. That's all I have to say. Just thank you very much for that really eye-opening talk.
Yeah, I would say that that's absolutely true. In the late 19th century, as the first generation of college-educated women emerged, many of them made the choice not to get married. And it was as if suddenly a whole world had opened up in addition to the traditional marriage and motherhood. And so many women made that choice. And a lot of the important volunteer organizations, like the National Consumers League and others, were filled with women who were not married and devoted their time, if they had the financial ability, to volunteer activities. I mean, if you think about the fight for suffrage, and Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who are considered so very important. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was married with many children, and she would write these wonderful speeches and develop this strategy. And Susan B. Anthony, who never married, could go on the road and present the arguments, but Elizabeth Cady Stanton had other responsibilities. So yes, Phyllis, I think it's very, very interesting about that. But for sure, it's true in the late 19th century. I can't hear that at all. I couldn't hear that.
No.
Okay, let's see. Oh, good. I wonder if there are any recordings of her voice or if that's even possible at that time. And then, what was my other one? Oh, I noticed how consistently women of any stature wore hats all the time. There are a wonderful collection of hats in these photos.
I don't know the answer about the recordings. I'm not sure it was possible. You could Google it and find out. I read that she was an excellent speaker, but I didn't try to find any recordings of her voice.
And the location was 800 South Halsted,
Yes.
and it's now part or adjacent to the University of Illinois in Chicago.
Oh, that's interesting. And actually, Larry, the address at first was 300. I did find that they changed the number. And I'm not exactly sure why. I guess because they acquired more buildings. But it was a lower number originally.
Yeah, I have a question. Apparently she was entered into the Chicago Gay and Lesbian Hall of Fame, and they view her as an important lesbian role model. Did she ever talk about it with her friends? They must have known something.
No, as far as I found in my research, historians still speculate about the nature of her exact relationship. And there were many women at this time who had very, very close friends who they loved, but it was not a sexual relationship, and we just don't know with Jane Addams.
Barbara, thank you for your inspirational talk. I think a takeaway, an important takeaway, is how it is necessary for us to know about the past and learn about the past, in this case, women's history. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for the advertisement, Sheila. I appreciate that.
When I was getting out of college and years before that and some years after that, there were many school districts in this country that did not allow teachers, because they were mostly female, to be married. And that did not mean that they were lesbians or had gay relationships. That was just the only way they could keep their jobs. And by the time that rule relaxed and spread more through the country, and is certainly non-existent now, I don't even think it exists in the Christian colleges and universities, but those women were too old to seek partners. And as we know, education paid very little. So many of those women lived together because that was the only way they could afford housing and the other kinds of
Yes.
amenities that were needed. And as for the hats, those hats were always prominent in history if you look at women's fashions. And then Jackie Kennedy kind of was the epitome of that with the pillbox hat. And after that, it kind of just left. And the famous Kathleen, she was a movie star. Anyway, she was one of the very first women that began to wear slacks, which was also very much frowned upon. So it would be an interesting kind of discussion and presentation to look at the changes of female fashions in this country.
Yes. Thank you for your comments. Yes.
Other comments or questions?
Yeah, actually, I shouldn't talk, but my husband should, because he lived in Illinois and his family were the neighbors of Jane Addams's house there, where her father lived and where she lived. And I heard a lot of stories about Jane, but like I say, I don't know enough. My husband did. So that's really all I have to say, is just to know, and we saw her houses.
Other comments or questions? Online, anybody who would like to say anything?
No.
If not, let's thank Barbara.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you for your help.
Fantastic. That was great.